Last week, we saw over 30 wide receivers score at least 10 fantasy points. Now, what's crazy about that is we had 6 teams on a bye. Now, with everyone playing, we should have a ton of options. So in today's show, we're going through the quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 15. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Today we're talking about some wide receiver rankings. Now before we get into the rankings, the first thing I want to do is see some of your playoff teams. Take a screenshot of your fantasy football team and then share it on Instagram or Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, and tag us in your post. We want to see what players are on a ton of fantasy playoff rosters. I think it's going to be fun to see, and you get to shout out your own personal fantasy football team. But now let's transition into the part of the show where we take a look at some of my bigger hits and misses from just last week. Now, when we start off with some of the hits, we got the likes of Jackson Smith-Njigba, Puka Nacua, and Brian Thomas Jr. Now, for JSN, everyone knows that I am a JSN truther, and last week I had him higher with the DK Metcalf injury. I had him up inside the top 15. He finished inside the top 15. Puka Nacua, I had him up inside tier 1 last week, and he finished as the wide receiver 2. And then Brian Thomas Jr., it's so hard to trust him with Mac Jones, but the upside was just too big to just forget about him. I ranked him as the wide receiver 24. He finished as the wide receiver 23. Now, when it comes to misses, had some big ones like Jordan Addison, T. Higgins, and F.U. Jaden Reed. For Jordan Addison, I had him up inside my top 36, but in no way was I expecting him to go out and get 8 catches, 133 yards, and 3 touchdowns, especially in a game that Justin Jefferson had 2 touchdowns as well. T. Higgins, it's really hard for him to do much of anything when Jamar Chase is out there on the field and he just can't be stopped. I knew as soon as I saw Jamar Chase show up in a 7-Eleven shirt, T. Higgins was probably going to be a disappointment. And then Jaden Reed. Everyone on earth missed on Jaden Reed last week in some form. If they don't admit it, they're lying, because no one expected him to go out and score a big fat 0, especially after all that crap he talked on a podcast with Amon-Ra St. Brown, talking about just watch when I come to Detroit. Well, we watched and we saw absolutely nothing from Jaden Reed, which now brings us to week 15, so let's bring up the tier 1 wide receivers. And looking at tier 1, we got the likes of Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, Tyreek Hill, and A.J. Brown. Now for Jamar Chase, he's going up against Tennessee. He has been absolutely unstoppable. The overall wide receiver 1 in fantasy football, and has 73 points more than the wide receiver 2 overall. He's on pace for a career high in targets, receptions, and yards. He already has a career high in touchdowns this year, and now he gets a matchup going up against Tennessee, whose secondary is banged up. Jamar Chase deserves to sit on top of the rankings once again this week. Then Justin Jefferson going against Chicago. Finally, some touchdowns for Jefferson. We said last week that the big game was coming, and it sure did. 132 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns against Atlanta. Now, he played against this Chicago team a couple weeks back and had a whopping 2 catches for 27 yards. Chicago took him away. Can they do it again? They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. But with the way that Sam Darnold is playing and Minnesota in must-win territory, I got Jefferson at number 2. Number 3 is Puka Nacua going up against San Francisco. Now, despite all the time he has missed this year, he is still on pace to have 1,000 yards receiving and a career high in touchdowns. He's had at least 115 yards receiving in 3 of his last 4 games, has had 8+ targets in 5 straight. The Rams, another team that needs to win, and the San Francisco defense is banged up. Then we move down to Nico Collins going up against Miami. He's off the bye week, and since returning from injury, he's had 15+ fantasy points in every game he's played, over 50% of the snaps. He's really been one of the only consistent parts of the Houston passing game all year long. Now, this is a tough matchup. Miami allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, but Nico is the only thing that works consistently in Houston when they're throwing the football. Then we got his opponent in that game, Tyreek Hill. After starting the season with single-digit fantasy games in 5 of his first 6, he's really gotten hot here as of late. Miami, they're in must-win territory, and Tyreek Hill is starting to produce. He's all the way up to wide receiver 14 on the year. He has touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games played, and the Houston Texans allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we round out tier 1 with A.J. Brown going up against Pittsburgh. And A.J. Brown is disgruntled. Do you remember the last time that he was verbally disgruntled in Philadelphia? It was last year. And after that, he ended up going for over 125 yards receiving in 6 straight games because of it. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen again, but I do think he gets fed. A tough matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, but if he can get fed those extra targets, I think we'll be pleasantly surprised. Now, before we dive into tier 2, let me shout out today's sponsor, SeatGeek, because I don't know about you, I prefer to go and have an experience somewhere than a wrapped present under a tree that I'm probably not going to use for more than a month or two. And that's where SeatGeek comes in, because with over 28 million downloads, they are the #1 rated ticketing app out there. There are over 70,000 events right now on SeatGeek. We know the NFL playoffs are right around the corner. The NBA and the NHL, they're in full swing. But right now on my phone, I'm contemplating going to the Duke, North Carolina game, and I'm trying to find some good deals on tickets. Now, with the lighting, I know it's tough to see, but we're trying to find... Can you see it? Can you... Looking for the green dots. Green means good, red means bad. And I say that because each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10, so we're looking for those green dots, but let's get it at a little bit of a discount as well. If you use our code word headliners, you're going to get 20% off at SeatGeek right now. That's right, $20 off your first purchase if you use the promo code headliners over on SeatGeek. But let's dive back into tier 2 here of the wide receiver position, so I can go buy some tickets when we're done. And we pull up tier 2, we see the names of Amon-Ra St. Brown, Terry McLaurin, Mike Evans, Cortland Sutton, Cooper Kupp, CeeDee Lamb, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now for Amon-Ra St. Brown, this may be one of his first times this season outside of tier 1. He's going up against Buffalo, and the dude done fell off here as of late. 3 straight weeks with less than 10 fantasy points per game. 3 straight games with less than 8 targets. No touchdowns in his last 3 games after having a touchdown in 8 straight games prior. The ball is just being spread around a lot more in Detroit. We're seeing Tim Patrick go out there and put up numbers. Now there's a matchup going up against Buffalo, who allows less than the league average to opposing wide receivers. That's why Amon-Ra St. Brown is at the top of tier 2. Then we got Terry McLaurin going up against New Orleans. He's coming off the bye and right into must-win games for Washington. A great matchup for him to gain some late-season steam as well. New Orleans allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and Noah Brown is now done for the season. How about Mike Evans going up against the Chargers? Evans needs 410 yards over his last 4 games to keep his 1,000-yard streak alive. We know that Bucky is banged up. Sterling Shepard is questionable to play. Evans is still resting throughout the week, but in must-win games, you have to expect him to be on the field and for the offense to lean on him. The Chargers do allow 25 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Cortland Sutton going up against Indianapolis, another guy coming off the bye week, and Denver, another team that needs to keep winning games to stay in the wild card hunt. Now, Sutton has been their best and most consistent wide receiver all year long. He's the current wide receiver 11 overall, hasn't scored under 11 fantasy points in a game since week 7, and the Colts allow right at the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Cooper Kupp going up against San Francisco, and you got to think with this being must-win games for the Rams, Kupp is going to stay highly involved. Since returning, he's had at least 11 fantasy points in all but 1 game. The San Francisco defense is banged up, and if he can get 8+ targets this week, all of his owners will be happy. Then we move down to CeeDee Lamb going up against Carolina, and I'm going to just go ahead and say it again. Dallas has the dumbest play calling I have ever seen. They go away from what works to do basic crap that doesn't work. CeeDee Lamb having less than 10 targets last week is an absolute joke. Now they have a matchup going up against Carolina, and a lot of people get excited, but Carolina has been better against the pass than the run. They actually allow under the league average when it comes to opposing wide receivers, but CeeDee is playing great. He just needs more volume. If he can get it, we'll be happy with his production here this week. Then we round out tier 2 with JSN, Jackson Smith-Njigba, going up against Green Bay. And as expected, he was able to find the end zone once again against Arizona last week. He's now had 10+ fantasy points in 5 straight games. He's the current wide receiver 6 overall on the year. DK, he's still not 100% healthy, and Seattle's still in a must-win situation. Green Bay has also been lit up through the air here as of late, so JSN right here at the bottom of tier 2. After tier 2, we move down to tier 3 where we have Jawan Jennings, Ladd McConkey, Gekey, Jerry Jeudy, Drake London, T. Higgins, Davante Adams, Garrett Wilson, Jordan Addison, and Zay Flowers. Now for Jauan Jennings, he's going up against the Rams, and last week he had good weather and his number one quarterback playing, so we saw good production once again. We also know that San Francisco cannot afford to lose another game. We also know their running game is banged up. It sounds like Isaac Guerendo plans to play, but he can't be 100%. But most importantly, do you remember what Jauan Jennings did against the Rams in their last meeting? I think you probably do. 11 catches, 175 yards, and 3 touchdowns. They could not stop him. Now, after Jennings, we go down to Ladd McConkey going up against Tampa Bay. And it sucked not having him out there last week, but what a great matchup for him to come back to this week. The Chargers' running game is non-existent right now, and Tampa Bay allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. In a must-win situation, even though he's coming off of an injury, Ladd McConkey needed to stay up inside the top 20. After him, we got Jerry Jeudy going up against Kansas City. And what we've seen from Jerry Jeudy over the last month or so of the season is absolutely nuts. He's up to the wide receiver 10 overall on the year, has 10 plus fantasy points in 6 straight. We know that David Njoku is out there dealing with a hamstring injury. Cedric Tillman's going to be in his first game back in multiple weeks, and this team will not be able to run the ball against the Chiefs. That's why Jerry Jeudy's all the way up to number 16. Then we got Drake London going up against the Raiders, and Cousins just can't play well enough to give us more Drake London ceiling games. He only has one 100-yard game all year long and no touchdowns in the last month. His volume has been great, 46 targets over his last 4 games, but not much of it is even catchable. In a matchup this week going up against Las Vegas, they allow right around league average to opposing wide receivers. Then we move down to T. Higgins going up against Tennessee. Do the words of Joe Burrow do anything for the production of T. Higgins? Now, it's great that Burrow wants him back next year, but delivering 2 catches for 23 yards against Dallas last week isn't gonna keep T happy. Now, I don't want to overreact. This was his first down game in quite a while, and we know that Jamar Chase absolutely feasted, but this is a tough matchup going up against Tennessee. They actually allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But just like we said with Jamar Chase, that secondary a little bit banged up in Tennessee right now. That's why we're not dropping T. Higgins too much. Then we move down to 19, Davante Adams going against Jacksonville, and the Jets don't have much to play for, but they could use some confidence heading into the offseason. Adams has really heated up here as of late as well. 10 plus fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played. 11 plus targets in 4 of his last 5 games played. And now a matchup against Jacksonville, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. After him is his teammate, Garrett Wilson. Finally, some signs of life. It was his first game in over a month with at least 45 yards receiving last week. The Jets, like I just mentioned, could definitely use a confidence booster, and with the running game banged up, I think Adams and Wilson could both find the end zone this week against Jacksonville. Then we move down to Jordan Addison going up against Chicago. So the one big game that he had 3 weeks ago wasn't a fluke, because he just had 133 yards and 3 touchdowns last week against Atlanta. Now he has touchdowns in 4 of his last 6 games played, at least 8 targets in 3 of his last 4 games played, and now gets Chicago, who he absolutely teabagged 3 weeks ago. We just cannot ignore how much Sam Darnold is looking his way as of late. Then we round out tier 3 with Zay Flowers going up against the Giants. He's coming off the bye, and a lot of fantasy owners are hoping for mid-season Flowers to return. Now, luckily, Baltimore is still playing must-win games. Now, typically, New York is a lot easier to run on than throw on, and a big Baltimore lead would absolutely kill the production of Zay Flowers this week. Now, with the way we've seen the Giants here the last month or so of the season, I kind of think Baltimore's going to get a big lead, and that's why Zay Flowers has dropped down the rankings to 22nd overall, the bottom of tier 3. Which brings us to tier 4, my boom or bust tier. We got DJ Moore, Jalen Waddle, Keenan Allen, DK Metcalf, Brian Thomas Jr., Marvin Harrison Jr., and Malik Neighbors. Now for DJ Moore, he's going up against Minnesota. He just had his worst game since the switch at offensive coordinator there in Chicago. Now he gets another game against Minnesota though, who he had 119 total yards and a touchdown against 3 weeks ago. But there's added incentive. The Bears are technically not eliminated from the playoffs just yet, but they cannot afford to lose one more game if they want to have any shot at the playoffs. I expect the Bears to be throwing a lot in this game because they will not be able to run against Minnesota. Then we got Jalen Waddle going up against Houston. And last week we talked about how in the past, Jalen Waddle had typically found success against the New York Jets. And he did once again. 9 catches for 99 yards just last week. He had a season high in targets, and Miami is another team that cannot afford to lose another ball game. Houston is also way easier to throw on than run on, so Jalen Waddle up inside the top 24 at 24. Now after him, we got Keenan Allen going up against Minnesota, and the Keenan Allen roller coaster continued last week. He's truly all or nothing. He straight killed it for 2 weeks and then absolutely disappeared in week 14. But they're going to need him this week going up against Minnesota because he had 15 targets, 9 catches, 86 yards, and a touchdown against them just 3 weeks ago. They're not going to be able to run the ball against Minnesota. Keenan Allen going to have to be involved. Then we have DK Metcalf going up against Green Bay. And how crazy is it that DK Metcalf doesn't have a 100-yard game since week 4? He also has no receptions, over 35 yards since week 3, and no touchdowns in a month. Now, we know he hasn't been 100% healthy, but he's only scored over 10 fantasy points 1 time since week 8, and that absolutely sucks for fantasy owners. Now a matchup going up against Green Bay, they're actually easier to run on than throw on. How about Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Jets? And he doesn't suck with Mac Jones, but he really just becomes more of a low-end wide receiver 2 or flex option weekly. He's still getting the volume, but minimal deep shots like he got with Trevor Lawrence. Only has 1 touchdown over the last 5 games played. Now this Jets defense is hurting, and we just saw the Miami Dolphins find quite a bit of success through the air against them last week. Then we move down to Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against New England. What is it with the 5 catches for 50-yard stat line? And why can he not go over that most weeks? He's only gone over 60 yards receiving 1 time since week 3, but the ceiling potential is always there, especially in must-win games for Arizona. Now a matchup going up against New England, they allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. After him, his other fellow rookie wide receiver Malik Neighbors going up against Baltimore. And this is such a good matchup, but how do you trust anything in this New York offense? Neighbors gets a ton of targets, but they really don't turn into much. He also ranks 49th when it comes to red zone targets, so he's not getting touchdown opportunities either. He has no 100-yard game since week 4, and now has Tommy DeVito at quarterback. Even though this matchup is great against Baltimore, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, it's really hard to trust any New York pass catcher right now, which takes us through tier 4. All we have left is tier 5. And right here in tier 5, we got Adam Thielen, Devontae Smith, Calvin Ridley, Khalil Shakir, Jacoby Myers, Cedric Tillman, and Jaden Reed. Now for Adam Thielen, he's going up against Dallas, and he has officially claimed the Bryce Young binky status. Back-to-back games with at least 10 targets and at least 8 receptions. He also has touchdowns in 2 of his last 4 games. Bryce and the Panthers are actually playing much better football, and Dallas is an absolute dumpster fire all around, so Adam Thielen at the top of tier 5. Then Devontae Smith going up against Pittsburgh. He found the end zone last week, which was great in his first game back off of injury, but he doesn't have a game over 40 yards receiving in his last 3 games. We also know that AJ Brown is out there complaining and probably going to get fed a lot of balls this week. Plus, it's a tough matchup going up against Pittsburgh, another boomer bust type play for Devontae Smith. Then we have Calvin Ridley going up against Cincinnati. He had good targets in his revenge game last week, but he really couldn't turn it into much. Really story of the year for the Titans. Now we know that Will Levis isn't fully healthy. We may end up with Mason Rudolph under center, and Ridley has really only had 4 solid fantasy days all year long. It's a great matchup though going up against Cincinnati, who allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we got Khalil Shakir going up against Detroit, and he had a huge week 14. 5 catches, 106 yards, and a touchdown against the Rams. It was only his 2nd 100-yard game of the year. Something that for sure plays a part is the scheduled return of Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid though. That could definitely hurt the target share of Khalil Shakir. We know that Buffalo's going to have to throw in this game though, just due to the Detroit run defense. Unfortunately, I just dropped him a few spots due to the potential split in targets with those guys returning. Then we have Jacoby Myers going up against Atlanta. The matchup was there last week. He got the volume that we all expected. He just couldn't do anything with it. 10 targets, 7 catches, 67 yards was a letdown for a lot of people. But who plays quarterback this week for the Raiders? Is it Aiden O'Connell? Do we see Desmond Ridder? Because this is a great matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they were just torched last week by the Minnesota Vikings. Really the only thing holding back Jacoby Myers is quarterback play at this point. Then we go down to Cedric Tillman going up against Kansas City, and he's slated to potentially return this week after missing multiple weeks with a concussion. How does he respond? Because we know at the time of this recording, there's a good chance that David Njoku does not play this week. That's a lot of potential targets that we could see go the way of Cedric Tillman, who we have seen perform in this offense before. But has Jerry Jeudy stolen all of his thunder? With questions like that coming off of an injury, I've dropped him down to tier 5. And then lastly, Jaden Reed going up against Seattle. I wanted to put him at the end of the list here so we could all thank him for absolutely nothing in week 14. He talked all that crap leading up to the game just to disappear. But here's what absolutely sucks. He screwed over a ton of fantasy players in week 14. He threw up the goose egg. A lot of people are throwing him on their bench, which means this is probably going to be the week that he goes freaking crazy on everyone's bench. I'm guilty of it too, but dang it, that's one of the worst things about fantasy football. All right, so there you have our quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 15. As you can see, we have a ton of options out there here this week. Now, if you haven't done so already, do me a favor by hitting the like button. It's free and easy to do, and it definitely helps us out here on YouTube. Now, I wish you all the best of luck, but I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain.